And so our next session is on the impact and lessons learned from COVID-19. We thought it was kind of important at this point in time to take a look back at the last year and just see what were those impacts? What did we learn from this? And, from a federal perspective, from a state perspective, as well as from an industry perspective. And so I know we're going to kick off the federal perspective with Nancy Jackson, and I believe she is joining us virtually. And so Nancy, if you could unmute yourself.
What we were going to talk about today, and what I was going to just very briefly cover, was a couple of the major legal authorities that are underlying the emergency actions that Fmcsa has taken during the COVID-19 national emergency. If you could go to my first slide, please. The first major authority that we have used, and that is probably the most familiar to everyone in the room, and that's Fmcsa's Emergency Declaration Authority under its regulations at 49 CFR 390.23. Under these regulations, a regional declaration of emergency results in regulatory relief from the majority of the federal motor carrier safety regulations. That is Fmcsa's regulations in 49 CFR parts 390 through 399. A regional emergency declaration that waives Fmcsa's safety regulations occurs when there's a declaration of emergency by one of three types of individuals: the President of the United States, a governor of a state, or Fmcsa itself. The regional declaration of emergency may cover one state, a regional area impacted by an emergency. The COVID-19 emergency resulted in the first ever nationwide emergency declaration from Fmcsa. That declaration was obviously based on the Declaration of National Emergency by the President of the United States. And under Section 390.23, the regulatory relief that is triggered from a declaration of emergency includes all regulations in parts 390 through 399. Now, to be clear, a state governor's declaration of emergency doesn't actually waive federal regulations, but it does trigger the emergency relief provisions in 390.23 and results in the emergency relief of the Fmcsa regulations in parts 390 to 399. Under a regional declaration of emergency, the emergency relief is for a maximum period of 30 days. After the initial 30-day period, only Fmcsa can extend an emergency declaration. Although not used in the COVID-19 national emergency, I did want to briefly mention that 390.23 also provides for emergency regulatory relief during local emergencies that can be declared by federal, state, or local officials. Again, that declaration of local emergency can trigger regulatory relief from Fmcsa's regulations in parts 390 through 399. But this regulatory relief is for a maximum period of 5 days, and it cannot be extended. As I mentioned a minute or two ago, Fmcsa can extend regional declarations of emergency. For example, the COVID-19 declaration. Fmcsa issued its original emergency declaration on March 13, 2020, immediately after the president declared the national emergency. That declaration of emergency has been extended with various modifications and restrictions since April 20th, and that declaration continues to be in effect. When Fmcsa extends a regional declaration of emergency, there is some additional authority that comes into play. That is under 49 CFR 390.25. The two big provisions is Fmcsa can extend the declaration for whatever time period Fmcsa believes is appropriate, and Fmcsa will establish that time period in the extension. And in that extension, Fmcsa can impose any necessary conditions and restrictions, including restricting specific regulations from being covered under the emergency declaration and requiring those regulations to be complied with. Wanted to briefly just mention when we're doing an emergency declaration, what does that mean? What are the circumstances when we can issue an emergency declaration? An emergency is defined as pretty much any natural or man-made occurrence. The key is that that occurrence interrupts the delivery of essential services or supplies or otherwise immediately threatens human life or public welfare. A motor carrier or a driver is eligible for the emergency relief under an emergency declaration when that carrier or driver is providing direct assistance to the declared emergency. Direct assistance is the transportation or other relief that is provided by a motor carrier or its driver for the immediate restoration of essential services or essential supplies. Direct assistance does not include transportation related to long-term rehabilitation of damaged physical infrastructure or routine commercial deliveries after the initial threat to life or property has passed. The other tool that Fmcsa used during the COVID-19 national emergency is the agency's authority to waive compliance with specific regulations under its statutory authority at 49 United States Code 31315. This is not a tool that is used extensively by Fmcsa, and waivers are to be limited in scope and circumstances under the statute. But during the COVID-19 national emergency, a few waivers were issued for specific circumstances. You're probably familiar with the waiver that was issued to states and drivers that allowed the state to extend the period of time that a commercial driver's license or a commercial learner's permit was valid when those licenses could not be renewed because of the emergency. Again, under the statute, they have to be very limited in scope and circumstances, and only certain regulations are eligible for waivers. These waivers, as an individual waiver, cannot extend past 3 months. Fmcsa, as you're aware, has issued multiple waivers, but each individual waiver has lasted for a period of no longer than 3 months. Fmcsa does post all of its emergency declarations and all state declarations that come to Fmcsa on its website, and posts all of its extensions to emergency declarations. So they're available to the public at any time we have them. We have 2 websites that are currently being used. The COVID-19 website is sort of a sub-website to the emergency declaration website, and there are links on both of them back and forth to each other. That's all I intended to cover. If there are any questions, we can do those now or after the other presentations.
Great, thank you, Nancy. I think we'll wait till the end to take questions, if that's all right. I will now turn it over to Joe De Lorenzo. Joe is the Fmcsa Acting Associate Administrator for the Office of Enforcement, and he's been with Fmcsa for almost 30 years, including 17 years working in field operations. Welcome, Joe.
All right, thanks. And thanks, Brenda, even though I said you don't have to do any introduction. I appreciate you doing that anyway. But thanks, everybody. It's really good to be here. I was just going to take a couple of minutes. The team asked me to talk a little bit about stakeholder and stakeholder. And it is an interesting topic because it's something that was very different, I think, than anything that we've ever seen before. So as I kind of thought back on it, there are some real lessons learned here that we should keep in mind and that we should use for the future. And one of the things I think that I wanted to start with, because when you look at kind of emergency management and crisis management, you know, you look at kind of what's happened over the last decade and a half or so, probably going back to 9/11. Really, crisis management started to change with 9/11, but then you go from there to sort of our, you know, not that any emergency situation is typical, but what do we normally deal with? Hurricanes, weather events, you know, military actions, things like that are what we're used to, oil spills in terms of crisis and emergency management. But what I found when you start thinking about what happened with COVID is it was a very different crisis and it was a very different emergency than anything that we dealt with before. And that's what drove to some changes in stakeholder engagement. So before talking about kind of the stakeholder piece of this, I wanted to talk about what was different about the COVID situation. The first thing that happens when you do any kind of crisis management, I'm sure a lot of you know this, is you start looking for information. And information is always very scarce. With COVID, it happened almost instantaneously, right? Everything was fine one day, and the next day, everything wasn't fine. And what didn't we know? We didn't really know anything. We didn't know the duration of the emergency, okay? We didn't know what the impacts of the emergency were. I mean, even with a weather event, you have some idea of how long it's going to take to resupply and do those kinds of things. You're going to know you're going to need food, water, lumber, things like that. With COVID, we didn't really know exactly what was happening, and information was limited to a degree that we hadn't seen before. Because whenever you're doing any kind of crisis management, you're always relying on lessons learned, what you've done in the past. We've got the weather thing down. We've done it 100 times by now. But with COVID, we had no information on what the impacts were going to be. And when you start talking about economics and the economy, which I think is what really affected transportation and the transportation sector, it was particularly relevant to think about that there, because the economy was really doing things that we hadn't seen before. And when I say economy, we're not just talking obviously about the United States, we're talking about globally. So what happened economically? Supply stopped and demand stopped at the same time in some sectors. Normally, you don't see that happen in any kind of situation. In other sectors, you saw supply skyrocket because there was no demand. In other places, you saw demand skyrocket and there was no supply. So it was a really complex situation from an economic standpoint, and that really impacted what was going on in the transportation sector. And when you start talking about what we do in transportation, we always struggle a little bit with the diversity of the transportation sector. But when you have a very limited crisis or a limited emergency that you're dealing with, it's easy to narrow in on what you need. Like I said, if you use the weather example, you're talking about food, electricity, water, lumber, medical aid, those kinds of things. So you can kind of narrow in on a transportation sector that you're going to have to worry about. Here, every single sector of transportation was affected at some point in time, and we had to kind of be able to balance that and be nimble enough, which is not generally what the federal government is good at in terms of trying to address those emergency situations. And lastly, when you talk about stakeholder engagement and you think about normal crisis and crisis management, again, you have a targeted group of stakeholders. Here, our stakeholder group was pretty much everybody you could possibly think of. It was all parts of the transportation sector, but then it was the federal enforcement side and what operations were happening there. It was the state and the state enforcement side, what was going on there. State driver's license agencies have never been part of our crisis management or emergency planning before. And then that's in addition to all of the other stakeholders that we always have to consider. Media, the Hill, all of the other people that we have to deal with. You throw that into the mix, and it was really a giant bowl of a mess in terms of how do you deal with stakeholder engagement. So, and there's people that I'm leaving out here. There was coordination with Homeland Security on security issues, TSA on transportation issues, but we'll put all those aside and we'll kind of focus on sort of what we normally deal with. The other thing that was going on at the time was that behavior was really unpredictable, right? Everybody knows that people hoard toilet paper during storms, right? Nobody ever saw people hoard toilet paper like they had before. People hoarded fuel when the instructions were, don't go anywhere. Okay, so everybody had lots of gas and nowhere to go. Okay, so trying to balance that out when you're talking with stakeholders means you had to have a lot more stakeholder engagement than normal. And you had to do it on all levels. And I think the multi-layered level of stakeholder engagement is really, I think, what helped us out. I think we did a pretty good job with COVID. I think there's a lot, you know, it's always easy to kind of second guess and go back and look at what you would do different. But from the FMCSA perspective, we're doing a lot of this high level, let's get the associations together, figure out what's going on with folks. But where the real value, because the situation was changing so often, were the informal, quick contacts that we had that happened not only from headquarters people, but from people like Scott and other people in the field at FMCSA to really understand exactly what's going on. So we had to step up. What everybody always says, you know, clear, frequent communication is key in any kind of crisis. Totally true. But with COVID, it was that plus. It was much more frequent, much more clear, and had to happen at both kind of the normal global formal level, but also at the informal level to really understand what was going on in the industry. And I think the easiest way for me to explain this, I don't do good with a lot of, kind of topical bullet points, is I was going to give you 2 or 3 examples of kind of how I saw it play out and what the lessons learned, from that are. And the first of those is, everybody likes to make jokes about toilet paper. And who doesn't, right? But one of the things I found, I did some research on this to see, and there are like a plethora of articles in scientific journals written about why people hoard toilet paper. Okay, it's an actual thing. But one of the things that we found out is when I was talking to the people that are supplying items like essential supplies like toilet paper, is we couldn't look at supply the way that we normally did. Because normally what happens? You just bring in more, you get more from the warehouse, but you go back to my example of the economy, warehouse didn't have any more toilet paper. There was no more supply, right? Nobody knew how long the demand was going to go on. Normally it's, I live in DC, it's a winter storm. So you're going to be out of commission for a day or two. People buy all the milk and bread and toilet paper they can, but then it's over. Okay. So what we saw when we started talking was how, or our hours of service, how will that impact this whole issue of kind of the normal transportation supply and how it actually works? And what we saw was supply and supply chain got completely disrupted and they changed it on the fly. So I talked to Walmart and I said, what are you guys doing? Walmart says, we're not using our normal transportation operations anymore. We're not going from manufacturer to warehouse to store. We're going directly from manufacturer to store, which means that long haul component of their operation was really affected more than what would be normally. Normally in an emergency, it's more of the short haul piece because it's warehouse to store type of operations. So that sort of valuable information is the kind of thing we got from those more personal, informal phone calls that maybe we wouldn't need. And that kind of drove a little bit about how we handle the emergency declarations. People always get frustrated, and this may come up later, with emergency declarations and not knowing when they're going to be renewed, how long they're going to work for. And we made conscious decisions to not let those emergency declarations be in place for a very long time. We could have done them for 3 months or 6 months, but we were doing 30 or 60 days at a time because we knew we were going to have to change them every time to be responsive to what those needs really were. The next example is the SDLAs, right? All of a sudden, one day, state driver's license agencies closed, right? Whoever thought about that? So you're like, okay, well, what does that really mean? And we start talking to state driver's licensing agencies, and that means no renewals, okay? No new licenses, no medical certificates, all these things that we had never really dealt with. And we had never done the way, Nancy went through some of the waivers and things, and we'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later. And you start talking to the SDLAs, and we were trying to figure out exactly what was happening. It's easy to say, okay, the SDLA is closed, but states aren't just going to close their SDLA forever. It was then, we're moving through appointments. And the conversations that happened there were, how do we prioritize? Because it's easy for me to think about SDLAs in terms of commercial driver's licenses and commercial driver's license endorsements, but that's actually a small part of what your state driver's licensing agency does. Okay, so they've got people calling them, complaining about their licenses and phone numbers backed up. And having those conversations were, okay, we need to keep some things moving. We know they're not going to happen at the pace that they were. So we're going to start to prioritize commercial motor vehicle operations. We're going to prioritize getting new licenses through. Even though you're extending it, we're going to try and keep doing that. So again, when you're talking about stakeholders and stakeholder communication, having those conversations, at that level is really important. And the last example is one that's most complicated and sometimes my least favorite to talk about, but everybody knows there was a run on meat and meat products, right? And livestock transportation is always a tricky issue, okay? But one thing we know about livestock and livestock transportation, or one thing we knew, at least before this happened, is that demand is fairly steady. So, okay, just to be clear, from the East Coast, so no expert on livestock. But what I do know now is when they're planning ahead and the meat companies are thinking about what demand is going to look like, they're looking a year to 18 months ahead, because you can't just make more beef, right? You got to let it grow. You got to do all these things that happen. And what happened was demand spiked at the top end. Okay, so demand spiked at full-grown cattle that are ready to go to slaughter and be sent to your grocery store. But that huge spike at the end of their supply chain left a gigantic gap in the middle. Okay, and so, you know, they're basically waiting around for cattle to grow, right? It's kind of where we are. And at the same time that that's happening, there's plant closures due to COVID. So it was really a difficult situation where when we start talking to livestock people, we're like, yeah, some hours of service things here will help you out. But what we're finding out is they're 3/4 of the way on a 1,000-mile journey to a slaughterhouse, and they get a call and says that slaughterhouse is now closed. And the driver has to stop, figure out where to go. They reroute that driver 750 miles in the other direction. You know, things like that were happening on a regular basis. So really, when you look at those just kind of as examples, it does sort of bring us down to some of the same basic points we've all talked about in terms of stakeholders and stakeholder engagement. But it does, especially from a federal government perspective, where again, I make jokes about it, but it's really true. The federal process is not designed to be very quick and very responsive. For a lot of different reasons that are good reasons. But in this case, we really had to focus on looking at that communication at a high level and those really informal pieces of communication that have to happen so that we could be as flexible as possible. And it comes down to a couple of things, okay? It comes down to really being honest and open with your stakeholders. And I say that and you kind of go, okay, that makes sense, right? But sometimes information flow isn't always that clean from the federal government, and sometimes it's not clean for a reason. So we have made some conscious decisions early on in COVID that we were going to say things that we hadn't said before about not knowing exactly what the situation was going to look like, you know, queuing in advance things that were going to change, things like that. So open and honesty up front with stakeholders was really important, more so than ever. The second thing was, remember, kind of on the softer side of it, that everybody was going through something, right? People are trying to save their business, but at the same time, they're dealing with their family and their family issues. And we were doing calls at all kinds of crazy times at night because everybody is trying to balance all of those things. And so knowing and understanding where people are in terms of their operations and in terms of their lives was an important lesson that, again, we hadn't seen because we weren't just buckling down for a week. You know, when I started doing some research on this, I found a lot of articles in August of last year that basically said we were wrapping things up. You know, there was a lot of articles written. It was, for some reason, August of last year, August of 2020, I guess things were almost done. Well, here we are, maybe just getting close to that point now. So kind of having that and being open to that is important. I said frequent communication, can't underscore that enough. And then lastly, again, just to kind of reiterate, the real lesson that I got out of this, which for those of us on the eastern half of the country just experienced the issue with the Colonial Pipeline, and applying the lessons of using both formal and informal communication during that particular issue coming out of COVID, I think was a huge benefit to us, because we did learn that you're going to get one set of information when you pull 50 of your stakeholders together on a call and say, okay, even if I'm going to get all my livestock folks and I'm going to get all the trucking industry and all the petroleum people separate, you still get a lot more valuable information when you have those one-on-one conversations to the extent that you can. So for me, that was probably the biggest takeaway, and something that I think will stick with me in crisis management going through with the future. So that's what I had for you, and I guess I'm going to turn it over to Scott to wrap things up.
Great. Thanks a lot, Joe. Appreciate it.
Well, good morning, everyone. Really a pleasure to be here to see faces, so many familiar faces, kind of a comfort zone, a little bit of a comfort zone, because you all know me and public speaking don't always go great. So it's good, and it's really tough to follow Joe and our administrator and Matt Packard. So this is my perspective. First of all, I would like to thank the industry. And so industry representatives that are here, please raise your hand, stand up real quick. Just coming to work every day. During the initial phases of this pandemic, everyone didn't know, right? And so industry comes to work. Our safety partners, state partners come to work, inspectors come to work, and troopers come to work and continue to move products back and forth in as safe as a manner as possible. And so that continued. And for that, I thank you all. I thank our inspectors down on the southern border, because ultimately, when we're staying and we're teleworking for safety, they're going to work every day, and there's these unknowns that are considered. So from my perspective, that dynamic was unique, very unique, in that everyone that needed to come to work still came to work despite all the unknowns early in the pandemic. So I'll try not to repeat a lot of the things that were said already, but ultimately, communication is what's critical. And I think going forward, that's the piece that we need to continue. I think that communication on the number of drivers, being able to get CDL drivers in the queue through training, that became some of the early issues that were going on. And whether it was the industry or state partners, that constant communication and walking through each step, and then being able to communicate to headquarters for some resolution became a challenge, and also something that I think that we can definitely move forward to keep improvements overall in our safety game, our safety goals, to make it better in the future. So as an example, with the commercial driver's license, the industry was the first to reach out, and then how did we maintain that consistency throughout the regions, and how are we going to make that work? And so that communication and that consistency that occurred is something that I think we early on struggled a little bit with, and then we began making a lot of strides towards meeting the timelines. And sometimes, and I'm seeing this lately, at the end of COVID, ahead of those challenges that we've seen, right? Ahead of the dynamics that might be coming next. And so that, from my perspective, it has been working very well. The things that haven't worked so well, and this is one of my passions, and I'll definitely talk about it later. I know it's everyone's passion in here, is what the ultimate crash picture looks like. So I would have predicted that the crash picture would have gone way down at the beginning of the pandemic, because less people on the road and other things. But ultimately, I don't think the crash picture, as we'll see the data coming out, and I think we're getting better at that too, is the timely data. But I don't think we've seen the crash picture really come down like we would have predicted during that time frame. And so how do we make that crash picture come down and continue to work towards that goal? And I think there's some challenges. I was talking to the colonel a few minutes ago before the conference started, and we were talking about speed, and he's long said, hey, people with higher speeds, people hit things really hard. And when you hit things really hard with an 80,000 pound vehicle, the end result is really bad, right? And so I think that the challenge is how do we reduce crashes with this new dynamic of probably what's higher speed. It's predictable that there's higher speeds because people got used to driving faster with less people on the road. We didn't drive down crashes necessarily that much then, but how do we do it now as we move out of the pandemic and we have higher numbers of vehicles out there and higher VMT going to go up, right? It's predictable that these things are going to occur. We're going into a summer where people have been cooped up and now people are saying, hey, I can get out a little bit. And so I think that that's our primary challenge as a group, is how do we address that reduction in crashes through these dynamics of what's going on mentally with people and how they want to get out and what we saw on the roads during the pandemic. And I don't know that data can capture that, but I think that collectively in this room, we can capture how we want to address those issues, get people to slow down, number one, and address some of the age-old dynamics, but then also have a sense of urgency for how we drive down these crashes, roadway crashes across our country. And what our deputy administrator said, hey, is you know, as a pandemic is a problem, a huge problem. We've known this for years. So how do we do that? And this is our biggest challenge, I think, coming out of the pandemic. I do want to spend a second to thank all of our state partners. I think this is one of the areas that worked really well, was we were able to get some masks early in the pandemic, things like putting together groups to go pick up, and the state partners that picked up pallets of masks and handed them out to commercial drivers. That was huge, a huge challenge, and instantly met across the board. So thank you all very much. So with that, I believe we're going to take questions now as a group. So I have a feeling that Nancy and Joe will get a lot more questions than I will. But we'll take questions now for the group and discussion points and I would be really interested to hear any ideas that maybe you have on how we address this crash picture coming out of the pandemic.
And do we have any online? Anyone want to raise your hand? Unmute yourself, ask a question. Type it in the chat box. You know, eventually we're going to make you all talk, you know that, right?
Eventually we start calling on people.
Right. Yeah, that was a lot of great information, though. I can definitely understand. I think you pretty much covered everything. Yeah. All right, well, we can go ahead. Oh, you have a question for us. All right.
Thank you, Leonard. Captain Dittman.
I'll try to break the ice here. I guess I'd like to hear a federal perspective on, I think higher speeds are obviously, we saw that throughout the pandemic. I think a product that we're going to see, though, is driver inexperience. The one industry that stayed strong throughout the pandemic has been the trucking industry. So I'd like to hear the federal perspective or possible future plans on addressing the number of new inexperienced drivers that we're probably going to see on the road.
Thanks, Scott. No, I mean, this is a huge question, and it's come up in a lot of different scenarios in terms of, as we're bringing, you know, we have this sort of, I'm going to stand too close to the speaker. We have this, move towards the light, she says. That doesn't sound good. But, you know, we're kind of battling like conflicting issues here, right? We keep talking about the fact that we need more drivers and that the industry is short of drivers, but we also know that driver inexperience is a huge problem. So from the federal perspective, you know, we kind of struggle with this, like, where do we just say, hey, this is just an industry problem? And where is it that we can actually, you know, that we can actually add something to this issue? And I think there's maybe a couple of points that have come up recently that might be worth mentioning, is that as we move towards entry-level driver training, which I'll talk about a little bit later, not to spoil all the fun of that. I do think that's going to help with the driver inexperience issue because it's going to formalize that training process. So folks are going to have to go through that step-by-step formalized training curriculum, which if nothing else, what you feel about the curriculum, how you feel about it, I don't know if that really matters as much. It is the fact that it starts to formalize that process and every driver goes through that same thing, because before we had this wide disparity, large companies, small companies, and we got different things. So I do think that as we move towards entry-level driver training, that will help. The other thing that you will see from us over the coming months and years is a bigger focus on the CMVOST grants, the commercial vehicle operator grants, because we do need to start looking at how we can reach into the communities a little bit more and attract more drivers and give them the ability to kind of work their way into the industry. Everybody wants the answer for me to say that the answer is going to be under 21 drivers is going to help, but that doesn't help you with your experience problem. Okay, focusing on military drivers, not necessarily helping with the experience problem. I think it's actually more of a cultural change that hopefully will be driven a little bit more by the entry-level driver training piece. And maybe that will give us a little bit more in terms of driver and driver experience. Because the tendency right now when you're short of drivers is to get a butt in a seat and get them going. And that's really not where we really want to be from that perspective. So I know that's a lot of kind of possible things that we can do, but I think you heard the deputy administrator talk about this a little bit. This is going to be something that we're going to be focusing on because the driver shortage is an economic issue, but it also is becoming a safety issue. And when you hear things like Scott's talking about with speed and things like that, those clearly are driver inexperience issues. There's one turn on the Beltway in DC that's pretty famous for having issues. And we had in a period of about 3 or 4 months during COVID, there were 11 truck rollover crashes on that one curve because there was no traffic to slow them down. That's a driver inexperience issue. So I think we're just going to have to dig deeper and look for some other ways to go. So I don't know, Scott, if you wanted to add anything to that or.
Well, so thank you. I do. I guess what I've known throughout my career is usually as drivers shortages go, so goes law enforcement shortages and other shortages that for some reason are a consistency. So out of the states in here, I have a question back for you. How many of you are facing, because this concerns me from a grant perspective and the ability to get the things done that we might want to get done as partners in this safety aspect. How many are short troopers and concerned about the number of troopers that you're short? And so I see in the room just a lot of hands raised. I imagine online there's a lot of hands raised. So in traffic safety programs, motor carrier safety programs, do you have concerns about getting your grant obligations done and this commercial vehicle safety obligations done amongst all the other challenges that you have? And so my question back is how do we get through those challenges and still reduce crashes? Leonard, you can go back. I'm just kidding. No, but I think that would be my part of the discussion that's similar to the driver education, because at some point law enforcement on the road or that visual deterrent for speed and some of the other following too closely, those are directly related in those high crash corridors. But if you don't have enough people to put on the road in those high crash corridors to perform traffic contacts in the traffic portion of the grants, then that's where I would like to have a discussion on how do we get there? How do we get there in that partnership to have that visual deterrent and have that education piece? Do you have officers that can go out and do education for commercial drivers? and these new commercial drivers to talk about the key crash and driver perspective. You know, those driver controlled, which is most of them, right? Crashes. Do you have officers that can go out and do those presentations? Or are we going to be short there too? Which also impacts this driver education, right? So how do we get through those challenges and still reduce crashes? I know that wasn't what you fully wanted, Leonard. Yes, sir.
I'm from North Dakota, very small state. We only have 159 sworn, but our biggest problem is we have so many competing overtime programs. We rely on overtime to get a lot of this type of work done. And we just have so many competing overtime programs, be it seatbelt, impaired drivers, distracted driving. I mean, you name it. We have a ton of different programs. So we really struggle. I mean, we're limited how many people we can have, and we can only do so much, but we just keep getting all these grants and everyone's kind of competing for it. So that's what we struggle with, is just having all these different programs and trying to fit our troopers into doing each one of these things. But it's just competing resources for everyone has an interest that they want to get done, to include Fmcsa, to do inspections. So we have so much overtime that we have available to us. There's just not enough time to get it all done. I guess that's our main struggle in our state, is just all those different resources that we have, all those different overtime programs coming in, a lot of them from the federal government, and just competing for that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. We do have a couple of questions and comments online. And so I would ask Dustin, if you wouldn't mind reading off the first one.
Is there a roadmap to mitigate the fatigue driving for commercial drivers from the industry perspective?
I guess just real quick, I think maybe 2 points on that. I mean, it's a little bit of the holy grail, right? I think it's something that we're all looking for, especially right now where we talked about drivers and driver shortages, maybe drivers working more that they want to. I think that I would point to maybe a couple of things. One, the North American Fatigue Management Program is something that was designed to help the industry work through their fatigue mitigation efforts. And we could probably post a link to that, but if you search North American Fatigue Management Program, I think you would find that. The other recommendation that I have when I talk to drivers and I talk to companies about their fatigue and their fatigue management is, it's hard to say that it's hard. The roadmap question is a tough one, because I actually don't want people to be looking for a roadmap. Because when you're managing fatigue, and from the industry side, at least in my experience, you need to be looking at your particular operation and how you're going to manage your fatigue there. That's what's nice about the North American Fatigue Management Program, is it gives you kind of those options, whether you're long haul or short haul. People say there's no fatigue issues with short haul. Right? Ask the petroleum tank truck drivers if they get fatigued after an 11 or 12 or 13-hour day now, under normal circumstances, let alone under an hour's service waiver. So I just kind of recommend, hey, look at your operation, look at where you see your fatigue, look at how you're running, and you need to make that an individualized thing from an industry perspective, but look at some of those other resources that are out there.
And I would just add, I think that it's a great question, first of all. From a personal aspect, I think that everyone has been in a car, and sometimes you feel like you're fatigued maybe 15 minutes into the trip, right? It's just not after long hours of accurate logs and keeping track of your time. So it really has to be a personal commitment to safety from the drivers that you hire, the training, and every individual out there, just like the personal commitment to do something like setting a cell phone down and not looking at it while you're driving, right? So I think that ultimately that's part of the partnership that has to go in all the way to that individual behind the wheel.
The next one's a comment and a question. I'm really intrigued by the idea of granular information from industry that the Deputy Secretary mentioned. Does that mean data on individual trips, and how did that work in terms of cooperation among industry and government oversight? Having it would solve a lot of problems from a safety modeling perspective, but it seems like a tough nut to crack at the federal level.
Well, we could just stick with the last sentence and just kind of leave it at that. You know, it is definitely a tough nut to crack at the federal level. I can maybe expand. I don't want to speak for her exactly, but in my conversations with her, you know, we do, I think, through our cooperation with the industry, and we need to have these conversations a little bit more about what granular data is available. She mentioned the ELD data, and there's some challenges with that, but the industry does have access to that data. And the kind of things that we're looking at, simple questions that I would like to know the answer to, like, how are drivers actually using split sleeper berth? You know, how many of them are? What really, you know, and I know that there's, you know, Dan and actually and some have some insight into this, but like, you know, what hours are drivers really working? How have those hours changed pre, during, and post-COVID? You know, that type of granular data at a trip or a driver level, again, it's somewhat of the holy grail, things that we really want to find out. But I do think, you know, what the deputy administrator is saying is, if we don't push and we don't try and get into the edges of the data that's available, we'll never really get to that point. So that kind of information, and I'm just giving you a couple of examples. There's a million other ones that are out there. How are drivers really using or abusing personal conveyance? You know, how long of a stretch are drivers actually driving without taking a break? Where does the 30-minute break come in under the current rules? All of those types of things are information that, you know, as we start to really look at issues, we need to stop thinking about the kind of this big picture. You know, we've got hours of service is there, and it's going to mitigate fatigue. It's got to get down and kind of back to answer the previous question was, you know, we need to start looking at more individualized per company and even per driver. It happens to everybody. A lot also has to go to what you did before you came on duty. You know, we've all done this before, and truck drivers have the same issues. So when you start getting into data and looking at, you know, how are drivers actually functioning? You know, what's actually happened in that 1 day period and in that 7 or 8 day period, and how does it impact fatigue? Those are the kinds of things that would be really nice to learn. And as we kind of push forward and looking at the long-term crash causal study and other things, we really want to get into those details to start to understand what's actually happening, because that's where we'll really be able to make the impact.
Great, thanks, Joe.
I have one last question in the chat here. Are new smart vehicle technologies having positive results in reducing crashes, such as intelligent cruise control, assisted steering, and speed limit warnings?
So yeah, again, I think there might be some other folks here that can talk a little bit more about that, but I will say that when you look at this at a company-wide level, there is no question that the safety technologies are impacting it. When you talk about the global fatalities, Scott mentioned this earlier, it's really hard to get your hands around what's having the impact. Fatalities are going up, right? But there's all these confounding factors that are happening here. There's speeds, there's road construction, there's all these other things that are happening. Driver occupant seatbelt use is actually a huge issue in terms of what's driving up fatalities. And technology can have an impact in there. Anecdotally, I can tell you, in talking to carriers that use seatbelt monitoring through cameras, fatalities are down. You know, adaptive cruise control and those types of technologies, the emergency, I'm blanking out on the right acronym, but the emergency braking systems, things like that certainly do have an impact on crashes and crash fatalities. But I think as those technologies be implemented, they're not implemented yet on a wide enough scale necessarily for us to really understand what the overall impact. But I think most of the carriers that you would talk to will tell you that they have definitely seen, a reduction, at that level in their company as they've implemented those technologies and as we continue to push into those areas.
Great, thanks again, Joe. Was there anything else, Dustin?
That's it for now.
Great, thank you, appreciate it. Any other questions or comments for anyone in the room? Oh, looks like we have one or two over here.
Isaac Gonzalez, Port of Entry. My question is regarding, it's in the same vein as the question. So with the emphasis on data that you've all collected and with trooper shortages, what role do you see technology such as virtual weighing stations or truck parking management information systems? What role do you see those kinds of technologies playing in reducing fatalities? Additionally, if it's a big role, what does FMCSA and this current administration plan to do on incentivizing states to build out those technologies?
Guess I'll go first. Thanks, Scott. So yeah, there's a lot in there. So if I don't get all of your pieces, let me know. But technology in the data-driven world that we're in, technology is going to be really the key to solving a lot of these issues, or at least giving us insight into these issues so that we can develop what those things are. There's a couple things you didn't mention, things like AI technology. All right, that to me, that's when we need to start processing large pieces of data and understand what's going on. That's kind of where we really need to look at. And when you start focusing on things like virtual inspections and data collection, I do think that that's an area where we do need to spend a little bit more time. We've talked about a lot of this for a long time. And just in my opinion, I know technology is hard. It's difficult implementation. It's just as hard to implement technology in the industry as it is in the States. Because when you talk about incentivizing, when you start to talk about implementing technology to the States and you say the word incentivizing, what does that mean? It means who's going to pay for it, right? And we always are going to be fiscally constrained. Right? So we need to find the ways where we can use that technology, the same way we talk about safety technology on the industry side, providing economic benefits to the carriers. Right? There's a large group of carriers that's been using ELD since the 1990s, not because they wanted to track hours of service, but because they wanted to increase efficiency. How can we take that conceptually to the states and say, we can incentivize you to use this technology, and now we're going to be able to gather X amount more times of data on the carriers that are passing through your state, on things like virtual weigh stations and, even partial inspections or even just data collection, on the vehicles that are passing through. So I think that that's, really important pieces to keep in mind. And I do want to backtrack to one point that you kind of raised in my mind that we need to think about, because obviously decreasing fatalities, this is the number one goal. But a complete and total focus on fatal crashes is not going to lead to that success. So when you talk about data and aggregating large amounts of data, we have to be aggregating data across all of the crashes that are out there. I mean, anybody, I know a lot of you here have done crash investigations. The difference between a fatality and an injury in a towaway fatal may be luck. It may be who was wearing a seatbelt. It may be what kind of vehicles were involved in the crash. So we need to be taking this kind of global look at, yes, what do all the fatal crashes have in common with each other? But if we only focus on, and that's a very small subset of the crashes that occur out there, about 5,000 of them out of the 120 or thousand crashes that are out there. So I do think that there's a huge role for technology in aggregating that data and looking across. And it all kind of starts to what can we get, from the state and the state level. So our continuing focus on data quality and data collection on crashes, as well as inspections, I think will get us a little bit further down the road.
So I just say too that you touched on a couple things, which is there anyone from FHWA here? So I think the key is, the total partnerships, which we're definitely committed to with all the different agencies, NHTSA, FHWA on infrastructure and how that plays a role in crashes, right? And such as Way in Motion. What can we utilize through that? What can we gain? And that's some of the granular aspects of it that I think we have some access to, but how can we get better at achieving our safety goals at the same time as achieving economic goals and infrastructure goals that we have as a whole, right? And so I think it's a great question. The key is how do we partner? How can we get better data and utilize each other's data to further achieve those goals? And then, and I knew this before, but I really know it now. Consistency in how reporting occurs is also key. Crashes aren't all reported the same way. There's some nuances. And so I think that that's one of the areas that we can get better in partnership with all the states in crash reporting. And I know how expensive it is to change those systems. But when we're looking for some of that granular data, consistency in how they're reported and investigated is key to getting that granular data that you really need sometimes to answer some of those tough questions that you ask. Thank you.
Morning. Odd question, but I'm wondering, as you mentioned how the expectation is now that there are so many more commercial motor vehicles coming out onto the road as the country opens up. And correlated with the fact, at least in my experience in my current company, I see about 80% of my crash involvements not at fault of the commercial motor vehicle driver. So when I'm looking at the public, I know we can't educate the public, they don't listen, but is the Fmcsa looking at the data analysis of these non-CMV at fault accidents and how they're going to increase with more trucks coming out on the road now? And if so, can we expect guidelines or educational help from the Fmcsa on how we should use that data that you're building in order to try and have our drivers reduce accidents themselves, obviously through defensive driving?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up excellent points. It's easy for us to sit here and focus on the CMV side of this, but it's a complex question. And it's not just non-CMV motorists. Scott just mentioned kind of CMV. It's how are construction zones set up? How is signage set up? I'm going to keep harping on construction zones because when you start looking at the statistics, it is not good at all in terms of kind of what's happening in construction zones. So I think on our side, it is about, and you heard the deputy administrator say this and others, how do we partner across the board to get generally traffic safety improved? Because if you improve overall traffic safety, you improve CMV traffic safety. And CMVs get picked on a little bit because the consequences, are so much higher. One of the things we've seen in the crash preventability determination program is that we have seen, particularly on rear end crashes, 95% of the rear end crashes that we've had submitted are not at fault in terms of the motor carrier, not the responsibility of the motor carrier. So what can we do? The next question is, I think I'm just kind of repeating what you said, but we do have some good data now that tells us that. We kind of knew it, but now you see it and you see the data. So what can we do on the educational side with the non-CMV? But also maybe there are some things we can do on the CMV side to increase visibility and things like that in terms of those rear end crashes. So as we learn more, I do think we need to push out into some of those things. And I know there's at least one person here from NHTSA That's the other partner where just kind of focusing on traffic and traffic safety and then looking at that operation around commercial motor vehicles, hopefully will help us to make a little bit more inroads into some of those problems, because I don't know what your 80% are, but I bet you a bunch of them are people running into the back of your trucks, right? So things like that are things that we really need to focus on.
We do grant states money and state patrols money, law enforcement to do traffic around commercial vehicles also. So there is that enforcement that goes on in a lot of that's focused on high crash corridors. So there is money that goes towards that effort also, but it kind of is, that's why I asked the earlier question of how many resources do you have to do that in some of our high crash corridors, and how can we better focus on those areas that may need focus. And I think information sometimes that the commercial vehicle industry may have will be helpful to us too. In your, out of those 80% that are not your fault, what type of accidents, what type of crashes are you seeing, and what are the dynamics surrounding those that may make us better at seeing a different picture that we could include in future studies and future looks on how to reduce those crashes. Because we don't always have all the information that you might have, right? From the driver's perspective and other things. Cameras, whatever it might be that you determine your crash causation as, from the industry standpoint, we don't always have access to that. So any sharing of that through the Fmcsa, through other partnerships, by calling us, we'll be glad to take that information, definitely. Yes, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely. But so as we already talked about, you talked about the funding to state troopers and whatnot. We know we don't have enough state troopers. I mean, at least not here in Colorado. Up on the I-76 corridor near where I'm at, I think we have 2 at any given point for a lot of miles, right? And so what I'm really, it's kind of something I've been looking into lately. There's tons of information. The internet's full. We've all seen 1,000 different articles on the same exact subject. I'm trying to focus down, how do I help train my drivers to avoid the four-wheelers that are out there now that don't know how to avoid more trucks on the road? And so I guess that was really just the focus of my question. And thank you for your answers.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's tough, right? There are some people that get in pretty continual crashes and they're never identified as at fault, or they maybe not get cited. But after so many, right, it might be a little bit of things that the drivers can do too, and in all vehicles, for sure.
Great, thanks everyone. Lots of good comments.